The signal was wrong. Keithra Voss had routed 11,000 distress calls through the coordination nexus in her 14 years at the desk, and she knew the shape of every standard emergency beacon in the registry. This one matched nothing. The frequency was ragged, the encoding stripped to bare minimum compression, and the origin point sat in a region of the chart that the nexus had labeled unmonitored, a dead corridor between the Vethani trade spine and the Drossic exclusion boundary, where no scheduled traffic ran and no relay infrastructure existed. She pulled the waveform onto her primary display and expanded it. The timestamp placed the signal's origin at 41 hours ago. The propagation lag meant the source was deep, far deeper into the unmonitored corridor than any commercial or military vessel should have been. Nexus, flag this for pattern match, she said. Her commissary clicked once, a habit she had never managed to suppress when something felt off. The coordination nexus was the largest emergency routing hub in the Vethani administrative province, a sprawling orbital platform staffed by 200 dispatchers, 46 comms analysts, and a bureaucratic layer so thick that the average distress call took 9 minutes to reach a qualified coordinator. Keithra had spent years learning to cut that number to 3. The pattern match came back negative. No registered beacon architecture, no known military or civilian encoding scheme. The signal was raw. Someone had built a transmitter from components that were never designed to be a transmitter, and had pushed a signal into the void with nothing but power and hope behind it. She keyed the waveform to her linguistic analysis suite. The audio layer resolved slowly, fighting through distortion and signal decay. A voice emerged, female, speaking in a language the Nexus did not have in its primary database. The translator flagged partial matches against 11 archived trade pigeons, then gave up and returned a confidence score of 19%. Keithra leaned back in her station. Her compound eyes swept the Nexus floor below her elevated coordinator's platform. 200 stations, most of them occupied, the soft amber glow of active displays reflecting off the polished chitin of her fellow dispatchers. A typical shift, cargo vessel with a failing drive in the Kethani belt, routed to salvage tug. Medical emergency on a Drossic passenger liner, routed to the provincial hospital ship. A mining platform reporting an atmospheric leak, routed to the nearest engineering response vessel. Standard, routine, nothing like the ragged signal still playing on her display. She ran the origin point through the navigational archive. The unmonitored corridor had been surveyed once, 40 years ago, when the Vethani had considered extending a trade route through it. The survey team had classified the corridor as economically non-viable, too far from major transit lines, no habitable worlds, no resource deposits worth the infrastructure cost. The survey data was sparse. 14 stellar objects, mostly brown dwarfs and rogue gas giants. One marginally habitable world on the far edge of the corridor, tidally locked, atmosphere borderline, no indigenous sapient life detected. 40 years ago. Nexus pulled the full survey file on that corridor, everything. The file was thin. 300 pages of geological data, atmospheric readings, and a recommendation to deprioritize. Keithra skimmed it with the speed of someone who had read 10,000 reports and knew where the useful information hid. The marginally habitable world was designated VTC 4417. Nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, high humidity, surface temperature averaging 29 degrees, standard in the habitable band. Gravity at 1.2 standard. That was heavier than Vethani baseline, heavier than most species in the administrative province. She filed that fact and kept reading. No follow-up survey, no colonization attempt, no recorded traffic to or from VTC 4417 in 40 years. The signal was still playing. The voice repeated itself in cycles, the same phrases looping with increasing desperation and decreasing clarity, as though the speaker had been transmitting for hours and her voice was failing. Keithra isolated the clearest iteration and ran it through the deep archive translator, the one that included dead languages, per-contact recordings, and intercepted communications from species outside the administrative province. The match came back at 78%. The language was Terran Standard English. Keithra's Caliceri went still. Terran, human, Earth origin. She pulled the species file from the Nexus database. It was thin, a diplomatic brief, a trade summary, a handful of incident reports from border interactions. The Terran coalition was not a member of the Vethani administrative province. They occupied a region of Space 3 transit corridors away, on the far side of the Drossic exclusion boundary. Contact was minimal. The diplomatic brief described them as cooperative, but insular, and noted that they maintained their own emergency response infrastructure independent of the provincial system. But this signal had not come from Terran space. It had come from an unmonitored corridor on the Vethani side of the boundary. The translated fragments resolved on her screen, partial, broken, gaps where the confidence was too low. Colony transport, reactor failure, 700 passengers, children, medical, atmosphere degrading, anyone please. 700 passengers, children. Keithra hit the priority override on her station. Every coordinator on the Nexus floor heard the chime. All stations, this is Coordinator Voss. I have an unregistered distress signal from the unmonitored corridor, grid reference VTC 4417. Origin species Terran. Colony transport, 700 souls, reactor failure, atmospheric degradation. Signal is 41 hours old. I am assuming primary coordination. All available response assets, report readiness. The floor went quiet for 2 seconds. Then the responses began. Station 12, Voss. Nearest provincial response vessel is the survey cutter Thresk. Current position Kethani Belt. Transit time to VTC 4417 approximately 61 hours. Station 8. Medical response vessel Quiet Reach is docked at Provincial Station 3 for refit. Minimum departure time 14 hours. Transit time approximately 53 hours. Station 22. No military or rescue assets within a 40-hour transit window of the unmonitored corridor. That region is outside standard coverage. 61 hours. The signal was already 41 hours old. That meant the earliest any provincial asset could arrive was over 100 hours after the initial distress call. What is the estimated atmospheric timeline for a Terran colony transport with 700 passengers and a failed reactor? She asked. Her environmental analyst, a young Vethani named Sareth who worked the station directly below hers, pulled the data. Based on standard Terran vessel specifications for that passenger count, atmospheric scrubbers on emergency power would sustain breathable conditions for approximately 80 to 90 hours after reactor failure. Beyond that, CO2 toxicity becomes critical. 80 to 90 hours. The signal was 41 hours old. That left 39 to 49 hours, and the nearest provincial vessel was 61 hours away. The math was clear. No Vethani asset could reach them in time. Keithra stared at her display. 700 people, children, drifting in a corridor that the Vethani had decided 40 years ago was not worth the infrastructure, sending a signal on a transmitter they had built from parts because their real transmitter was dead, speaking a language the Nexus barely recognized, and the provincial system her system, the system she had devoted 14 years to making faster and better and more responsive, could not reach them. She opened the cross-boundary communication channel. This was the channel used for diplomatic contacts, trade negotiations, and the rare interprovincial coordination request. It was not designed for emergency routing. Using it for a distress relay required authorization from the provincial coordinator, a process that normally took 2 hours. Keithra did not have 2 hours. She transmitted the distress signal raw, along with the translated fragments and the grid coordinates, and addressed it to the Terran Coalition Emergency Response Authority. Then she flagged her own transmission as an unauthorized cross-boundary relay and attached her personal coordinator identification so that when the administrative review came, and it would come, there would be no question about who had made the decision. The response came in 11 minutes. Not from the Terran Emergency Response Authority, from a ship. Coordination Nexus. This is Commander Lena Hargrove, UNES Anvil Station. We have received your relay of the distress signal from VTC 4417. We are a forward logistics platform currently positioned at Transit Point Delta 7, which places us approximately 19 hours from the coordinates you have provided. We are retasking 3 vessels from our current assignment to respond. Please confirm the distress details and provide any updated intelligence on conditions in the corridor. 19 hours. The signal was 41 hours old. 19 plus 41 was 60. That put arrival at roughly 60 hours after the initial distress within the atmospheric window, if the lower estimate held, cutting it dangerously close if it did not. UNES Anvil Station. This is Coordinator Voss, Vethani Coordination Nexus. Confirmed. Signal details as transmitted. We have no additional intelligence on conditions in the corridor. The region is unmonitored and unsurveyed for 40 years. No navigational hazards on record, but the data is outdated. We have no assets that can reach the site within the atmospheric window. You are the only viable response. Understood, Coordinator. Advise that we are dispatching the following: Rescue Cutter UNES Blackwall, Medical Frigate UNES Solace underway, and Fleet Tug UNES Gantry Hall. Blackwall is fastest, estimated arrival 17 hours from now. Solace underway, 19 hours. Gantry Hall, 22 hours. Blackwall will establish contact and begin atmospheric stabilization. Solace will provide medical support. Gantry will tow the colony transport to a repair facility. 3 ships, 1 rescue cutter, 1 medical frigate, 1 fleet tug. Dispatched in 11 minutes from a logistics platform that Keithra had never heard of, positioned at a transit point that was not in the Nexus database. UNES Anvil Station. Confirmed 3 vessels are en route. Affirmative, Coordinator. And I should advise you that Anvil Station itself is repositioning to provide long-range communications relay for the operation. We will serve as your real-time link to the response team once they enter the corridor. Our comms array is considerably more powerful than the vessel's shipboard systems, and the corridor has no relay infrastructure. They were moving their entire station to serve as a communications relay. A logistics platform, a facility that by any reasonable assessment should have stayed where it was, and let the 3 ships handle the response, was repositioning itself to support the rescue. Coordinator Voss. The voice of Provincial Coordinator Draman came through her station's internal channel. Draman was the senior administrator of the Nexus, a Vethani who had held the position for 23 years, and who ran the organization with the meticulous precision of someone who believed that protocol existed for a reason. Coordinator Draman. You transmitted a cross-boundary relay without authorization. Yes. The review will be filed. In the meantime, you are primary coordinator for this response. Keep me updated. That was all. Keithra had expected more: a reprimand, a directive to hand off coordination, a reminder of the 14 procedural steps she had skipped. But Draman had been a dispatcher once. He knew what 41 hours and a failing atmosphere meant. She turned back to her displays. The tracking data from Anvil Station was feeding into her system now. 3 vessel signatures moving at high transit speed through the boundary region toward the unmonitored corridor. The Blackwall was fastest, pulling ahead of the other 2, its drive signature reading well above the standard safety margin for sustained transit speed. Running hot, pushing their engines past the rated limits to shave hours off the arrival time. Keithra opened a second display and began building a coordination overlay, the kind she used for complex multi-asset responses. Vessel positions, transit vectors, atmospheric projections, communication relay paths. She layered them onto the corridor chart and watched the picture form. 3 moving points converging on a single stationary one. A rescue unfolding in real time across a region of space that her own system had classified as not worth watching. Sarath, recalculate the atmospheric timeline based on a worst-case scenario. 700 passengers, elevated stress levels increasing CO2 production, possible damage to the atmospheric system beyond the reactor failure. Sarath pulled Terran physiological data from the Nexus archive, cross-referenced metabolic CO2 output rates for stressed populations, and factored in the reduced scrubber efficiency that the distress signal had described. He was thorough, which was why Keithra had requested him for her shift rotation 3 years ago. Worst case, breathable atmosphere fails at approximately 74 hours after reactor failure. That gives the Blackwall a window of approximately -8 hours. They arrive after the atmosphere fails. At worst case, yes, by approximately 8 hours. Keithra felt the cold mathematics settle into her thorax like stone. At best case, the Blackwall arrived with perhaps 12 hours to spare. At worst case, it arrived to a ship full of the dead. The gap between the two scenarios was defined entirely by variables she could not measure from a desk 14 transit corridors away: the actual condition of the scrubbers, the actual number of compartments still sealed, the actual metabolic load of 109 children whose breathing rates she could only estimate from a species brief that was 11 pages long and written for diplomatic context, not emergency medicine. She opened the channel to Anvil Station. Commander Hargrove, we have recalculated the atmospheric timeline. Worst case places atmospheric failure at approximately 33 hours from now. Blackwall's current ETA is 17 hours. If the worst case holds, that provides a margin, but if there are complications we have not anticipated. Coordinator, Blackwall's captain, is aware. She is running at 118% rated drive output. She knows the math. 118%. Keithra had never seen a vessel push that hard outside of a combat emergency. The strain on the drive would reduce the ship's operational lifespan by months. The captain was burning her ship's future to reach 700 strangers in time. She pulled the Terran vessel specifications from the diplomatic archive and studied the drive tolerances. At 118%, the Blackwall's main drive would begin accumulating fatigue stress in the containment coils. At 125, the coils would start microfracturing. Captain Emmerich was running in the narrow band between fast enough and too fast, the margin where every hour saved cost the ship something permanent, but the ship would still fly. At her station, the other calls kept coming. The Nexus did not stop because one coordinator was running a cross-boundary rescue. A Vethani ore hauler reported a collision with debris in the Kethani belt. Keithra routed it to Station 4 and went back to the corridor. A passenger vessel requested medical evacuation for a crew member with cardiac distress. Station 9 handled it. She processed the routine calls with the automatic precision of 14 years of practice. Her attention split between the mundane machinery of the Nexus and the 3 moving points on her corridor overlay. At hour 4, Draman reappeared at the edge of her platform. He stood without speaking for a full minute, watching her work, and then left. He did not ask for an update. He had been watching her displays remotely. He always did during complex operations. At hour 6, the Blackwall's drive signature flickered. Keithra caught it on the overlay before Sarath did a momentary dip in the output reading, gone in 3 seconds, the signature resuming its steady burn. Blackwall Coordinator Voss, we registered a drive fluctuation at your position. Confirm status. Captain Emmerich's response was calm. Confirmed, Coordinator. Number 2 containment coil showed a harmonic anomaly. My engineer isolated it, adjusted the coil balance, and we are back to 118%. No impact on ETA. A harmonic anomaly in a containment coil at 118%. On a rescue cutter being asked to do something, it was built to survive but not built to enjoy. Blackwall, recommend you reduce to 110% to preserve coil integrity. Negative, Coordinator. We have the margin to manage the coil. Reducing speed is not an option. It was not the answer a Vethani captain would have given. A Vethani captain would have calculated the risk, weighed the coil integrity against the arrival timeline, and followed the regulation that said drive components showing anomalies must be reduced to rated output until inspected. Captain Emmerich calculated the same risk, made the same assessment, and chose the 712 people over her engine. The hours passed. Keithra did not leave her station. She ate at the desk a pressed nutrition bar that tasted like nothing, washed down with cold water. She monitored the 3 vessel signatures as they crossed into the unmonitored corridor, and the tracking data became intermittent, relayed through Anvil Station's repositioning array. At hour 9, a second signal arrived from VTC 4417. Same ragged frequency, same improvised transmitter. The voice was different, male, deeper, speaking with the slow deliberation of someone conserving breath. This is Chief Engineer Marcus Cole, Colony Transport Meadow Lark. We have 712 passengers, including 109 children under the age of 12. Our reactor failed 50 hours ago. We are on emergency battery. Atmospheric scrubbers are at 11% efficiency. CO2 is at 2.9% and rising. We have sealed non-essential compartments to reduce the atmospheric load. Estimated time to critical CO2 levels, 24 hours. We have 19 injured from a structural incident during the reactor failure. Our medical staff is treating them with limited supplies. Our navigation system is offline. We do not know our exact position. We are broadcasting on all frequencies we can reach. If anyone hears this, we have children aboard, please. 50 hours since reactor failure, 24 hours to critical. The Blackwall was now 8 hours out. The math worked. Barely. If the engineer's estimate was accurate, the Blackwall would arrive with approximately 16 hours of margin. But CO2 estimates from inside a failing ship were notoriously unreliable. The models assumed uniform atmospheric mixing, which never happened in a real vessel with sealed compartments and variable occupancy. Keithra relayed the updated signal to the Blackwall and the other 2 vessels. The response from the Blackwall's captain was immediate. Coordinator Voss, this is Captain Dara Emmerich, UNES Blackwall. We have the updated signal. Adjusting approach profile. We will enter VTC 4417 orbital space in 7 hours 40 minutes. Request any navigational data you have on the system. We are flying blind in this corridor. Keithra pulled the 40-year-old survey data and transmitted it. She then did something she had never done in 14 years at the Nexus. She opened a channel to the Drossic Border Patrol and requested a navigational update on the unmonitored corridor. The Drossic response was curt. The corridor is outside our jurisdiction. We have no current data. Do you have passive sensor records from your border monitoring arrays? Anything that might show traffic or debris in the corridor over the last 50 hours? A pause, then grudgingly, we will check, stand by. The Drossic sensor data arrived 40 minutes later. It was sparse. The border arrays were oriented inward, toward Drossic space, and the corridor was only in their peripheral range. But there was enough. 3 navigational hazards that the 40-year-old survey had not recorded: a debris field from a decommissioned relay satellite, a rogue asteroid that had drifted into the transit path, and an anomalous gravitational reading near VTC 4417 that suggested the brown dwarf closest to the planet had shifted position since the last survey. Kithra transmitted the data to Blackwall. Captain Emmerich acknowledged with a single word, appreciated. It carried more than its syllables. Kithra had pried data from an unwilling border patrol in a jurisdiction that had nothing to do with the rescue, for the benefit of a foreign military vessel that was not part of her system, and the captain's single word told her that the data mattered, that the 3 hazards she had uncovered might have cost hours they did not have. At hour 10, a communication arrived from the Vethani Provincial Diplomatic Office. A junior attaché named Thern wanted to know why the coordination nexus was in direct communication with Terran military assets and whether proper diplomatic channels had been observed. Kithra sent back a 2-sentence reply. There is a colony transport with 712 people running out of air. Diplomatic channels are available for comment after the rescue is complete. Thern did not respond. She suspected Drammen had placed a call. At hour 11, the Blackwall's drive signature showed a second fluctuation. This one lasted 7 seconds, long enough for Kithra to pull the containment coil telemetry and see the harmonic oscillation pattern that meant fatigue stress was accumulating faster than the engineer's adjustments could compensate. Emmerich did not report it. Kithra noted it, calculated the implications, and decided that the captain knew more about her own engine than a dispatcher 14 corridors away. She kept watching. At hour 12, the tracking data showed Blackwall decelerating. The ship was approaching VTC 4417's orbital space, bleeding speed from its sustained burn, the drive signature showing the strain of hours at 118% output. Coordinator Voss, Blackwall is entering the VTC 4417 system. We have located the colony transport Meadowlark on passive sensors. The vessel is in a degraded orbit around VTC 4417, approximately 400 kilometers altitude. No active emissions, the ship is dark. We are closing for visual confirmation. Dark, no active emissions. Kithra felt her commissary clench. Blackwall, confirm, no electromagnetic emissions from the colony transport. Confirmed, the ship is on minimal power. We are detecting faint thermal signatures consistent with life support on emergency battery. The vessel appears intact but non-functional. We are coordinator. We have visual. The Meadowlark is a standard Terran Horizon-class colony transport, approximately 300 meters in length. Significant external damage to the reactor section. Hull appears intact forward of the engineering spaces. We are initiating docking approach. Blackwall, what is the atmospheric status of the vessel? We will not know until we dock and breach the atmosphere. Exterior sensors read the hull as sealed. Internal atmospheric data requires physical contact. Docking took 47 minutes. Kithra listened to every second of it on the open channel, the background filled with the sounds of a ship matching velocity with a dead vessel, in an unstable orbit around a world that nobody had visited in 40 years. The Blackwall's crew called out readings in clipped, professional voices, range, velocity differential, attitude alignment, docking clamp engagement. The clamps locked, the atmosphere bridge pressurized, and then Captain Emmerich's voice came through, and it carried a quality that Kithra had heard only a handful of times in 14 years, the controlled calm of someone describing something that was worse than expected. Coordinator Voss, we have breached the Meadowlark's forward airlock. CO2 levels are at 3.6%. That is above the Terran cognitive impairment threshold. The air is breathable, but the passengers have been in impaired conditions for an estimated 6 to 8 hours. We are deploying portable atmospheric scrubbers immediately. First team is moving to locate the passengers. 3.6%. The engineer's estimate of 24 hours to critical had been optimistic. The atmosphere had degraded faster than he had calculated. Sealed compartments, variable occupancy, the metabolic load of 109 children who breathe faster than adults. Blackwall, status of the passengers. Moving through the vessel now. The passengers are gathered in the forward habitation section. They consolidated into the smallest available space to reduce the atmospheric volume they needed to maintain. Smart. It bought them time. We are coordinator. We have contact with the passengers. They are alive. Impaired but alive. The children many of them are unconscious. The adults who are still alert are showing signs of significant CO2 exposure. Our medics are deploying oxygen supplementation now. How many are conscious? Estimating approximately 400 of the 712. The rest are in varying states of CO2-induced unconsciousness. No confirmed fatalities at this time. No confirmed fatalities. 712 people, 53 hours since reactor failure, and no one had died yet. The engineer who had sealed compartments and rationed the air. The passengers who had consolidated into a smaller space. The decision to keep the children in the center of the group, where the air was marginally better because the adult's body heat rose and carried CO2 upward, while the lower, cooler air near the deck stayed slightly cleaner. All of it had bought just enough time. Coordinator Voss, we have located Chief Engineer Cole. He is conscious. He has been manually regulating the atmospheric scrubbers for the last 29 hours by hand cycling the filtration medium. The automated system failed, and he built a manual bypass using components from the navigation console. He is coordinator. This man has been turning a hand crank for 29 hours to keep the scrubbers running at 11% efficiency. Keithra said nothing for a moment. Then, is he injured? Exhaustion and early CO2 impairment. His hands are severely blistered. He refused to stop cranking when we arrived. My medic had to physically pull him off the mechanism and show him that our portable scrubbers were already running before he would let go. She heard something in Emmerich's voice that she recognized. Not just professional reporting. Something beneath it, a tightness, a register that came from seeing something that made you recalibrate what you thought people were capable of. Emmerich's crew moved through the Meadowlark with systematic efficiency that Keithra tracked through the telemetry. The portable scrubbers were placed in the habitation section first, then distributed forward and aft to establish atmospheric flow throughout the vessel. The medics worked in pairs, one checking vitals while the other administered oxygen from portable tanks. The Blackwall's supply manifest showed that the rescue cutter carried enough portable atmospheric equipment for a vessel twice the Meadowlark's size. That was not standard loadout for a cutter of that displacement. Someone in the Terran logistics chain had decided that their rescue vessels would carry more than what was needed, not because the regulations required it, but because the moment they were needed and fell short was the moment people died. Oversupply as philosophy. Keithra filed that observation. It was, she thought, the difference between a system that planned for the expected and a system that planned for the worst. The Vethani coordination nexus was excellent at routing the expected standardized distress beacons, registered vessels, known corridors, established protocols. It was built for the 99% of emergencies that fit inside the categories. The Blackwall's supply manifest suggested a system that had been built for the 1% that did not. At the same time, Emmerich's crew was discovering the full scope of what had happened aboard the Meadowlark during its 53 hours of silence. The colony transport had been carrying families, skilled workers, agricultural specialists, teachers, 2 doctors, and a small administrative staff. The reactor failure had occurred during transit without warning. The engineering team had attempted emergency repairs for the first 12 hours, before Cole had concluded that the reactor was beyond salvage, and had shifted all effort to maximizing the time the emergency batteries could sustain life support. The decision to consolidate the passengers into the forward habitation section had been made by the transport's captain, a woman named Sarai Linden. She had created a rotation system for the remaining functional crew, 2-hour shifts of activity alternating with 6 hours of enforced rest in low-movement positions to reduce metabolic CO2 output. She had rationed the food supplies, redistributed water stores, and established a makeshift medical station. When the atmospheric scrubber's automated cycling system had failed on day 2, Cole had built the manual bypass. When the communications array had gone down with the reactor, Linden had authorized Cole to dismantle the navigation console for parts to build the improvised transmitter. Keithra learned this in fragments, relayed through Emmerich's updates as the Blackwall's crew spoke with the Meadowlark's passengers. Each fragment added another detail to the picture of a community that had held itself together through competence, discipline, and the particular stubbornness that came from having 109 children depending on the adults to find a way. The Blackwall's crew worked through the next hours stabilizing the Meadowlark's atmosphere. Keithra coordinated from the Nexus, relaying updates to the Solace underway in the gantry hall, tracking the atmospheric readings as the portable scrubbers dragged the CO2 down from 3.6 to 3.0, then 2.5, then 2.0. Coordinator Voss, we have a complication. Emmerich's voice was steady but carried a new edge. The Meadowlark's hull integrity is compromised in the lower cargo sections. We are detecting a slow atmospheric leak. The scrubbers are compensating, but the leak is larger than the portable units can overcome long-term. My engineers are patching, but the damage is extensive. The cargo hull took impacts from internal structural fragments during the reactor failure. Pieces of the reactor housing blew forward through 3 interior bulkheads before the emergency barriers caught them. Shrapnel from their own reactor, blown through 3 bulkheads. The Meadowlark's passengers had been living above a hull section that was slowly bleeding atmosphere into space. Can your engineers seal it? They are working on it. Estimate 4 to 6 hours for a temporary patch. But the microfractures along the bulkhead seals are extensive. Each point has to be located by running a pressure differential test, identified, cleared, and sealed with bonding compound that needs 40 minutes to cure. We have found 11 fracture points so far. Estimate 20 to 30 total. 20 to 30 fracture points, 40 minutes each. That was 13 to 20 hours of continuous seal work. Meanwhile, the scrubbers held the CO2 at 2.4% better than the 3.6 on arrival, but still above optimal, still imposing a metabolic load on 712 people already weakened by days of exposure. Emmerich's engineers worked in shifts, 2 at a time, crawling along the interior bulkheads with pressure differential scanners and bonding compound applicators, sealing fracture after fracture with the methodical patience of people who understood that this was not dramatic work but necessary work, and that the difference between 2.4% CO2 and 1.8 was the difference between passengers who recovered normally and passengers who developed long-term respiratory complications. At hour 14, another complication. Coordinator Blackwall, we have a passenger medical emergency. One of the adults who regained consciousness has gone into cardiac arrest. Our medic is performing resuscitation. The patient's records indicate a pre-existing cardiac condition, managed with medication that ran out 3 days ago when the Meadowlark's pharmacy stores were depleted. Blackwall, do you have Terran cardiac stabilization pharmaceuticals on board? Affirmative, standard emergency cardiac kit. My medic is administering now. 90 seconds passed. Keithra watched her displays and did not breathe. Coordinator, patient stabilized, heartbeat restored. He is critical but alive. He needs the Solace's surgical team. Solace underway. ETA is now 3 hours. Can the patient be maintained? My medic says yes, but he is not comfortable with the margin. Another margin, another calculation, another set of minutes that separated survival from loss. Keithra added the cardiac patient to her coordination log, flagged the case for the Solace's surgical team, and transmitted the patient's available medical data ahead so the surgeons could prepare. The unconscious passengers continued to wake. The Blackwall's medics moved through the habitation section, checking vitals, administering oxygen, prioritizing the children. Coordinator, we have all 109 children accounted for, all alive. 12 are showing signs of extended CO2 exposure, confusion, headache, nausea. No permanent damage expected. The remaining 97 are recovering normally. All 109 children alive. Keithra marked it in her log. In 14 years, she had coordinated responses where the children did not all come back. Those entries sat in her records like dark stones, and she carried them the way a surgeon carried the faces of patients who did not leave the table, not as guilt, but as weight, the kind that settled into the structure of who you were and stayed there. This one would not join them. At hour 17, the Solace underway arrived. The medical frigate was larger, heavier, its hull showing the reinforced plating and prominent medical insignia of a vessel purpose-built for mass casualty response. 200 medical berths, a full surgical suite with 3 operating theaters, 31 medical staff. During the 19-hour transit, someone aboard the Solace had read Keithra's transmitted medical data on the cardiac patient, identified the medication gap, synthesized the required compound from onboard pharmaceutical fabricators, and had it ready in a sealed case before the frigate finished its docking approach. No coordination request from Keithra. No prompting. They had simply read the data and done the next thing that needed doing. Captain Emmerich's handoff report to the incoming medical vessel was thorough. Solace, the primary medical concerns are CO2 exposure aftereffects, dehydration, malnutrition. The Meadowlark's food stores ran low 3 days ago, and the passengers have been on reduced rations. 19 passengers with injuries from the initial reactor failure, including 4 with fractures and 1 with internal injuries requiring surgical intervention. 1 cardiac patient currently stable on emergency pharmacologicals. He needs your surgical team immediately. Chief Engineer Cole has second-degree burns on both hands from a chemical leak during his manual scrubber operation, which he did not mention to anyone until we physically examined him. The cardiac patient Elias Wren, 63 years old, a retired craftsman who had sold his home and his workshop to join the colony expedition, and whose heart had failed because the medication keeping his mitral valve regulated could not be synthesized from a stripped navigation console, was transferred to the Solace's surgical suite within minutes of docking. The synthesized compound stabilized his cardiac rhythm during transit to the operating theater. The surgery took 2 hours. Valve repaired with a biocompatible graft, prognosis stable. Wren would live to see the colony world he had sold everything to reach. The woman with internal injuries, a Shamaran, 40 years old, an agricultural engineer, had been quietly bleeding from a lacerated spleen for 2 days before telling anyone, because she had been helping care for the children in the habitation section and did not want to take medical resources away from them. By the time the Solace's trauma team reached her, she was pale and her blood pressure was dropping. The chief surgeon operated for 3 hours, repaired the laceration, transfused 2 units from the Solace's universal donor reserves. Success. Full recovery expected. When she woke, the first thing she asked was whether the children were all right. The Solace's pharmacist, a quiet, methodical woman named Tors, spent the next 6 hours restocking the Meadowlark's depleted medical supplies. She cataloged every medication the colony transport should have carried, cross-referenced it against the Solace's stores, and filled the gaps without a requisition form, without an authorization code, without consulting anyone above the rank of senior pharmacist. When Emmerich's supply officer pointed out that the transfer exceeded the standard intervessel medical supply protocol, Torres said, "They need it and we have it." That was the entire conversation. She opened a channel to Commander Hargrove at Anvil Station. "Commander, I must ask. The response time from your platform, 11 minutes from my relay to your confirmation of vessel dispatch. That is faster than most responses within our own provincial system. Coordinator, we maintain a standing rapid response posture for exactly this kind of scenario. Our vessels are fueled and crewed at all times. When a distress signal comes in, we do not convene a review board. We go." The decision to reposition Anvil Station itself as a communications relay, that was not a standard operational response. "No, that was my decision. The corridor has no relay infrastructure, and I was not going to have my rescue teams operating without real-time communications back to a coordination center. You are providing that coordination, Coordinator Voss. That made it essential to maintain the link. Commander Hargrove, you have deployed 3 vessels, repositioned your station, and committed significant resources to rescue 712 people who are not citizens of your coalition, in a region of space that is not under your jurisdiction, based on a relay from a dispatcher who transmitted without authorization. Coordinator, with respect, I did not deploy based on jurisdictions or citizenship status. I deployed because there were 712 people who needed help, and we were the only ones who could get there in time. The rest is paperwork." At hour 22, the gantry hall arrived. The fleet tug was ungainly broad, flat, bristling with towing arms and structural reinforcement equipment. Its captain, Yusuf Ibarra, surveyed the Meadowlark's damage with the unhurried eye of someone who had towed worse. "Coordinator Voss, the Meadowlark's reactor section is unsalvageable. The containment failure was catastrophic. The forward hull is structurally sound. I can rig a tow configuration and haul her to the nearest repair facility. Estimated tow time to Provincial Station 3, 41 hours. Captain Ibarra, Provincial Station 3 is a Vethani facility. The Meadowlark is a Terran vessel. Coordinator, Provincial Station 3 is the nearest facility with a dry dock large enough to receive a Horizon-class transport. My orders from Commander Hargrove are to get these people somewhere safe. Where the dry dock is, and who owns it is a secondary concern." Kithra authorized the tow, another decision for the administrative review. She did not care about the paperwork. While Ibarra's crew rigged the towing configuration, Emmerich's engineers sealed the last of the microfractures, 26 in total. The atmospheric bleed stopped. The scrubbers, no longer fighting the leak, drove the CO2 to 1.4% within 2 hours. Clean air, breathable air, the kind of air that 712 people had not tasted in days. The Blackwall's medics set up a feeding station in the Meadowlark's forward common area. The passengers received hydration fluid and nutrition from the Blackwall's own stores. The medics did not ration. Kithra noted the supply consumption rate and calculated that the Blackwall was expending its own provisions the cutter's crew needed for return transit. Emmerich's crew was giving away their food and trusting the Solace would resupply them. The Solace did resupply them, without being asked. The quartermaster loaded crates onto a transfer shuttle without a requisition form, without a supply authorization code, without any of the 14-step procurement process that the Vethani system would have required. The quartermaster loaded the shuttle crossed to the Blackwall, the Blackwall's crew unloaded it, and people ate. 41 hours under tow, Kithra did not leave the Nexus floor. Sareth brought her food twice and water 4 times. Other coordinators stopped by her platform, not because they were assigned to the operation, but because the entire Nexus had been listening. 200 dispatchers, 46 analysts, and for 63 hours Their attention had been split between their own cases and the 3 Terran signatures on Coordinator Voss's overlay. The Meadowlark arrived at Provincial Station 3. The station's administrative staff had been notified. Kithra had seen to that, cutting through 3 layers of bureaucratic process to ensure that temporary housing, medical facilities, and food stores were prepared for 712 Terran colonists who had never set foot on a Vethani station. The drydock received the Meadowlark. The passengers disembarked into temporary housing, blinking in the unfamiliar light, legs unsteady from days in a failing ship. A woman carrying a child on each hip stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked up at the Vethani station architecture, the curved walls, the insectoid design aesthetic, the soft amber lighting that the Vethani preferred, and that cast the corridor in tones that no Terran structure would have used. She stood for a moment, taking in a world built by a species she had probably never encountered, and then she walked through the door without hesitation. Whatever strangeness the station presented, it was warm and pressurized and safe, and those were the only qualities that mattered to someone who had spent 3 days breathing air that was slowly trying to kill her. A group of children, 8 of them, holding hands in a chain, came down the ramp together. The oldest was perhaps 11. The youngest was carried by the second oldest and could not have been more than 3. When a Vethani station attendant stepped forward to guide them, the child at the front looked up at the attendant's chitinous face and compound eyes and multisegmented forelimbs, and said something that Kithra could not hear over the feed. The attendant paused, then knelt in awkward motion for a Vethani body not designed for kneeling, and extended a forelimb. The child took it. The chain followed the attendant into the station, 8 children holding hands with an insectoid alien, walking through a corridor built for a species that had 6 legs and compound eyes, and none of them looked afraid. The transport's captain, Sarai Linden, disembarked near the middle of the stream. She walked down the ramp with the upright posture of someone who had been responsible for 712 people for 53 hours, and who would not allow herself to slouch until every one of them was off her vessel and on solid ground. Her uniform was creased and stained. Her face was drawn. She had not slept, Kithra estimated. In at least 40 hours she had been the last person in the rotation Linden herself had established, taking the shortest rest periods and giving the longer ones to her crew. At the bottom of the ramp she stopped and faced Captain Emmerich. Kithra could not hear the exchange over the feed, but she saw Linden extend her hand, and she saw Emmerich take it, and the handshake lasted exactly 3 seconds, 2 professionals acknowledging each other across the space between what had happened and what could have happened. Then Linden walked into the station without looking back. One of the Meadowlark's 2 doctors, Dr. Joanna Tate, stopped at the bottom of the ramp and stood very still for approximately 10 seconds, looking at nothing. Her medical coat was still on, pockets bulging with the improvised supplies she had been using for the last 2 days, torn fabric bandages, a dietary supplement she had been rationing as pain relief, a small toolkit she had borrowed from Cole for splinting fractures. Then she pressed both hands against her face, held them there for a count of 5, and lowered them and walked into the station. The gesture of someone who had been holding clinical composure for days, and who had just, in 5 seconds of privacy at the bottom of a ramp on a station built by a species she had never met, allowed herself to stop being the doctor and start being the person who had almost lost patience she could not afford to lose. Chief Engineer Marcus Cole was the last one off. He walked down the ramp under his own power, his hands wrapped in medical dressings from the Solace's burn unit, his coveralls still bearing the chemical stains from the scrubber leak he had not mentioned. His face was drawn and gray. Captain Emmerich walked beside him, not touching him, just present, a professional courtesy between 2 people who understood what it cost to hold things together when the equipment failed. At the bottom, Cole stopped and looked back at the Meadowlark hanging in the drydock cradle. The ship looked worse from the outside than the internal reports had suggested. The reactor section was a gutted wreck. The hull plating buckled and scorched, the engineering decks open to vacuum. The forward section, where 712 people had lived for 53 hours, was intact only because the emergency bulkheads between the engineering spaces and the habitation decks had held. Keithra saw something cross Cole's face that she recognized even through the low-resolution feed. Relief. The kind that came not as a wave but as a collapse, the sudden structural failure of the walls a person had built inside themselves to hold everything in place while the crisis was still running. And beneath the relief, the particular grief that belongs to someone who had held everything together by will and raw endurance, who had cranked a handle for 29 hours because stopping meant that 109 children would stop breathing, and who was only now allowing himself to feel how close it had come. Emmerich said something to him. Keithra did not hear it, but she saw Cole nod once slowly and turn away from the ship and walk into the station. Provincial Coordinator Draman appeared at Keithra's station. He stood beside her for a long moment, watching the disembarkation data scroll across her displays. 200 dispatchers had been at their posts for the duration, but the floor was quieter than usual, because many of them were watching Voss's overlay in their peripheral displays, tracking the final moments of an operation that had consumed the Nexus for 63 hours. "The administrative review of your unauthorized relay has been filed," Draman said. "I expected that. It has been filed and closed. I signed the closure myself. The finding is that the relay was operationally justified under emergency protocols and that no procedural violation warrants further action." Keithra looked up at him. Draman's compound eyes were steady. His thorax plates settled in the posture she had learned to read over 14 years as quiet approval. "You did the right thing, Voss. You did it the wrong way procedurally, but you did the right thing. The procedural way would have taken 2 hours. They did not have 2 hours. I know, that is why I closed the review." He paused. "The Terran Commander Hargrove. She has requested a formal communication with the Nexus. She wants to establish a standing emergency coordination protocol between Anvil Station and our system, a direct channel for cross-boundary distress relays, no diplomatic clearance required." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I would need to consult with the provincial administration. Then I realized that the provincial administration would take 4 months to approve it, and I told her yes." Keithra's commissary clicked twice. That was the closest she came to a laugh. "There is one more thing. The Terran vessel captains have filed their after-action reports. Commander Hargrove forwarded a summary as a diplomatic courtesy. Captain Emmerich's report states that the coordination provided by the Vethani Coordination Nexus, specifically by you, was instrumental in the successful outcome. She notes that the navigational data you sourced from the Drossic Border Patrol allowed her to avoid 3 hazards that could have delayed arrival by up to 4 hours. She notes that the atmospheric timeline calculations allowed her medical team to prepare correct treatment protocols. She notes that the real-time coordination you maintained throughout the 63-hour operation ensured that all 3 vessels and Anvil Station operated as a unified response rather than 3 independent efforts." Keithra said nothing. She also notes, and this is from her filed report, that the Vethani dispatcher identified the distress signal, translated it, calculated the timeline, determined that no provincial assets could respond, located the only viable response capability across the boundary, transmitted without authorization, and then coordinated the entire rescue from a desk 14 transit corridors away, for 63 hours without rest. The 712 survivors of the Meadow Lark owe their lives to the fact that one person decided that the right thing to do mattered more than the approved thing to do. Keithra felt something shift in her thorax, not pride exactly, something quieter. The knowledge that the system had worked, not the administrative system, not the procedural system, but the deeper system. The one that existed underneath all the protocols and the routing tables and the authorization chains. The one that said, "Someone is calling and you answer." "Commander Hargrove's direct channel proposal," Keithra said. "The one you approved without waiting for the provincial administration." "Yes. I would like to be the Nexus liaison for that channel." Drammond nodded once. "I had already assigned you." He left. Keithra sat at her station and looked at the data. 712 people, 109 children, all alive. She thought about Marcus Cole, turning a hand crank for 29 hours because the automated system failed, and the children needed air, and he was the one who knew how to build a bypass from a navigation console. She thought about Sarai Linden, organizing the consolidation into the forward section, because she understood the atmospheric math, and knew that reducing the volume meant extending the timeline. She thought about a sham Marin, hiding her internal bleeding for 2 days because the medical supplies were limited, and the children needed them more than she did. She thought about Dara Emmerich, burning her ship's containment coils at 118% because the 7 hours saved by running hot were the 7 hours that separated arrival from aftermath. She thought about Tors the pharmacist, restocking a foreign vessel's depleted medical stores because they needed it, and she had it, and that was the entire calculation. None of them had done anything extraordinary. None of them had performed miracles or bent the laws of physics or achieved something that transcended the boundaries of what their species could do. Each of them had done the next thing that needed doing, and the next thing after that, and the next thing after that, for 63 hours, without stopping and without waiting for someone to tell them. It was allowed or authorized or procedurally correct. The accumulation of those ordinary decisions, stacked one on top of the other like the layers of a bulkhead seal, each one holding pressure against the one below it, was what had kept 712 people breathing. That was what the Terrans did, not grand gestures, not heroic last stands. They showed up and they did the work, and they did not stop until it was done. And when you asked them why they had crossed a boundary and burned their engines and given away their food and synthesized medication they were not required to carry, they said, "They needed it, and we were the only ones who could get there in time. The rest is paperwork." She had not saved them. She had sat at a desk and routed information. She had translated a signal, calculated a timeline, found the right people, connected them to the problem, and then kept the connection running for 63 hours while the people who could do the physical work did it. That was the job. You did not go into the burning building. You found the people who could, and you made sure they got there. She had sent the relay. In 11 minutes, 3 ships were moving. In 17 hours, the first one arrived. In 63 hours, it was done. Keithra Voss logged the final entry in the coordination record. Case number 4417V Colony Transport Meadow Lark. 712 passengers, 109 children. Reactor failure in the unmonitored corridor. Atmospheric emergency. Cross-boundary relay to Terran Coalition assets. 3 vessels dispatched. Full rescue. No fatalities. She paused. Then she added one line to the record, in the notes field where the bureaucratic apparatus rarely looked. 3 ships came. They were not ours, they came anyway. Sareth was watching her from the station below. "Coordinator Voss, you should rest." "Soon." "You said that 9 hours ago." "And I was correct then too." "Soon." She looked at the tracking display one last time. The corridor was empty again. The Terran vessels were powering down at Provincial Station 3, their crews rotating through rest cycles with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this before and would do it again. Anvil Station was beginning its long transit back to its original coordinates, the massive logistics platform turning ponderously in the void like a creature returning to its den. The Meadow Lark sat in the dry dock like a broken bird, waiting for hands that would mend it. 712 people were breathing in the temporary housing section of Provincial Station 3, in a facility built by Vethani engineers. maintained by Vethani staff, and funded by Vethani taxpayers, none of whom had been consulted about receiving 712 Terran colonists, and none of whom, Kithra suspected, would object when the logistics reports were published. The Nexus had received 16 messages from other coordinators during the final hours of the operation. 14 of them asked if additional support was needed. 2 of them simply said, "Well done." She shut down her primary display. The amber glow faded. The Nexus floor hummed around her, 200 stations, 46 analysts, the perpetual machinery of emergency response continuing its work. There would be other signals, other calls, other corridors where the math was tight and the procedures too slow, and someone had to decide whether the right thing mattered more than the approved thing. Kithra would be at her desk. She would answer. The signal from the Meadowlark had arrived at the coordination nexus at 04:17 station time on a day that no one on the nexus floor would forget. Within a year, the direct emergency channel between the Vethani coordination nexus and the Terran Coalition's forward logistics network was handling an average of 3 cross-boundary distress relays per month. Within 2 years, 4 other administrative provinces had requested access to the protocol. Within 3 years, the Drossic Border Patrol, the same organization that had grudgingly provided passive sensor data at Kithra's request, had signed a memorandum of understanding to share real-time navigational data with the Nexus for all unmonitored corridors adjacent to their exclusion boundary. Within 5 years, the Galactic Standard for Emergency Response Coordination cited the VTC 4417 incident as the precedent for cross-boundary distress relay authority, the case that established that a dispatcher's obligation to a distress signal superseded jurisdictional boundaries, that the right to call for help was not limited by which species you were or which government space you occupied, and that the obligation to answer was not limited by whose desk the call landed on. Coordinator Kithra Voss was not consulted on the precedent ruling. She did not attend the committee session that adopted it. She was at her desk, routing a signal, because someone was calling and the math was tight, and she had already decided, 14 years and 11,000 calls ago, that the right thing mattered more than the approved thing. It always had.